Hi guys, another fantastic guest for you today. Someone whose scientific work I admire greatly, Joe Henrich. How you doing, sir?
Doing well.
Okay,
Nice
so
to
let me.
meet you.
Oh, and thank you for coming on. Just to for those of you who may not know who Joe is, a very brief introduction. He's a professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University. Canada lost him. He used to be at UBC. We could be proud that he was in Canada, but apparently he decided to go south now. His, his Google Scholar citations, for those of you who care about such metrics, it's certainly one measure of the influence of one's work, is almost at 29,000, which is a very impressive number. Many publications. We'll probably discuss a few here. And his books include the most recent book, which we'll talk about, The Secret of Our Success, How Learning from Others Drove Human Evolution, Domesticated Our Species, and Made Us Smart. And I think about 10 years ago, Why Humans Cooperate, a Cultural and Evolutionary Explanation. So what I thought we would do, Joe, is maybe start with thank you for sending it to me. Here you go.
Yeah, you're
Uh,
welcome. Good.
I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but here's what I did notice is I went through the book and there was a glaring omission. I know of someone who studies a very fundamental part of culture called consumer behavior from an evolutionary perspective, yet
Right.
somehow he was missing. What's going on there?
Well, I was mostly focused on kind of the early part of human evolution, trying to before consumer behavior
There
became
you go.
so
There you go.
central.
Good save. So tell us about the book. I did watch one or two YouTube clips where you give us a synopsis of it. Maybe you could start by doing that for us.
Sure. So the central idea in the book is that to really understand human evolution, we have to understand how our ability to learn from each other, so to transmit ideas, beliefs, values, and practices over generations, shapes our genetic evolution. So in particular, humans, unlike other primates and other species, seem to have something that we call cumulative cultural evolution. So the idea is one generation passes down how to make a tool, say, the next generation makes it a little bit better. They pass those improvements down to the next generation. And over many generations, you get something that no single individual could have figured out in their lifetime on their own. So the process becomes smarter than we are. And the idea is that the products of this process of cumulative cultural evolution become the primary selection pressures in human genetic evolution. So something like tools gives rise to our dexterity, complex languages affects our tongue and our brains, and to allow us to acquire language, increasingly complex language. And eventually institutions begin to shape our sociality and begin a process that I call self-domestication.
So this is very much what I mean. Obviously, some of the folks will understand these terms, but others won't. This is what we refer to as gene culture coevolution or dual inheritance models. It's very your work is very much situated within that tradition, correct?
Yep, that's right. And I mean, I'm doing a lot of things in the book. I'm trying to open up new questions. I'm trying to bring different kinds of evidence to the earlier work. In the beginning of the gene culture coevolutionary work, much of the work was just theoretical. Kind of unlike other parts of, say, evolutionary psychology, there's this really strong mathematical, theoretical foundation to gene culture coevolution. And it was only really in the 90s that people began to really turn the empirical wheels.
Now, the example that I typically discuss when I lecture about the different approaches to studying culture from an evolutionary perspective, when I discuss gene culture coevolution, is of course the classic example. The equivalent of the peacock's tail when you discuss sexual selection is the lactose intolerance and pastoral living. Maybe you could first explain what that example is, and are there now many other similar examples that are as compelling and as easy for people to understand?
Yeah, I mean, so there's now a large literature on this. So Kevin Leyland published a review in 2010, and Pete Richardson, myself, and Rob Boyd published another review a few years later in PNAS. And the lactase is still the best documented case. So here the idea is with the spread of domesticated animals, their availability created a new nutrition source. So normally humans can process milk from mom as children, but then the standard mammalian setup is that it shuts off. And so adult animals lose the ability to break down the milk sugars, lactase into lactose sugars. They use lactase enzymes to break down lactose sugars. And but what happens in some parts of the human species, actually a minority, about 36% of humans, have an ability due to certain genes to break down these sugars into adulthood. And this allows them to access the bounty of nutrition that's available in milk. And we can use the history of different populations in terms of their dairying to predict the frequency of those genes in modern populations. And in particular, you need two facts. One is you need whether they were pastoralists, whether they had domesticated animals that could be milked. And two, they had to not develop cheese and yogurt technology, because these things allow you to break down the sugars without the genes. So it's kind of a cultural solution to the same problem. And so that spread pretty rapidly. In 7,000 years, it's at the 36%, so rapid diffusion. Another gene that's interesting is alcohol dehydrogenase. So there's variation in our ability to break down alcohol. And alcohol probably wasn't a big factor in terms of humans drinking a lot of alcohol until the origins of agriculture. So you can look at when places got agriculture, and those places have higher rates of a variant that actually causes you to process the alcohol more quickly and dumps it into your bloodstream. And this actually gives you a flush, and it kind of makes you feel unpleasant. So the idea is that it inhibits your susceptibility to alcoholism.
So in both sorry to interrupt. In both of these examples that you gave, in a sense, they're consumatory phenomena. One is, how you process or synthesize milk. The other one, alcohol. What are some examples of gene culture coevolution that may not be of that within that taxonomy?
Well, another one is blue eyes, or light eyes. Green eyes are a variant of blue eyes. So this is related to agriculture in the sense that, so you have hunter-gatherers in Europe. They have plenty of access to vitamin D. But then as agriculture, dependence on grains spreads, it spreads into Europe, and it goes up into the Baltic region. And the Baltic region is the one place on Earth where you can do high-latitude agriculture. So people stopped hunting and gathering. They began doing, I don't know whether the hunter-gatherers were replaced or they adopted, but in either case, people started doing high-latitude agriculture. This meant they weren't getting enough vitamin D, and there was a strong selection pressure for any kinds of genes that would lead to lighter skin that would allow you to make more vitamin D. One variant of those genes reduces the melanin in your skin, but it also takes the melanin out of your eyes. And when you take the melanin out of human eyes, they're blue or green. So it's actually the brown in brown eyes is the same melanin that's in your skin to turn it brown. So this is an example of the spread of agriculture into high latitudes that gave us blue eyes. And if you look at the map of blue eyes, it's really clustered around the Baltic and spreads out from there.
Very interesting. Now, one of the things that I love about the work that you do, other than the specific content of the phenomena that you study, is the fact that your work attacks one of the sort of fundamental annoying canards that are typically levied against evolutionary behavioral scientists. Well, I guess there are two related ones. One is that evolutionary scientists don't care about the environment. Well, your whole work is based on that interaction. And of course, secondly, the false dichotomy of environment or culture versus genes. And of course, you're showing that culture itself is not something that exists outside of our biology, outside of our genes. So have you found that your work has been influential in moving people on these dimensions? What I mean by people, I don't necessarily mean the lay people. I mean the detractors within academia. When they see your work, does that attack those canards?
Well, I don't have anything that looks like hard data, but I know, for example, when I talk to psychologists, they seem to be much more interested and energized by thinking about our capacities for learning as adaptations, because that puts the focus on learning, but it means you can use the power of natural selection to develop hypotheses about who people should learn from, when they should learn, when they should rely on learning from other people versus other kinds of learning, when you override instincts. So some of the chapters in the book look at our ability to override our own innate instincts. Say, one example I give in the book is use of spices and chili pepper. So these are culturally evolved that seem to protect us from the pathogens in meat. This evolves unconsciously, but the chemicals in things like chili peppers are actually a product of evolution to keep mammals like us away from them, because they want to be eaten by birds, so they're better dispersed. But when you grow up, the power of our cultural learning is such that we can turn pain into pleasure and learn to like chili peppers and enjoy the burning feeling rather than be averse to it.
You know, it's when you said that some of the psychologists appreciate the learning components of your work, I wonder if it's because many of them are ultimately social constructivists, and to the extent that you introduce the word learning, then somehow that seems epistemologically in line with their worldview, right? So you are admitting that humans have the capacity to learn, and so maybe that's what softens your work in their eyes. Could that be a possibility?
Yeah, sure. But it also may allow them to get to some of the phenomena that they're most interested in. So one of the things I emphasize is that we want to dissolve the intellectually destructive dichotomy between learning and cultural explanations on one side and biological or evolutionary explanations on one side. You can have a phenomena, and you're probably going to need learning explanations, but those are ultimately rooted in these evolved capacities. So that becomes a learning explanation is a form of evolutionary explanation. And then for any complex phenomena, you're probably going to have a few different things involved there.
Are you a pluralist when it comes to the various approaches that would fall under the rubric of the evolutionary behavioral sciences? And I ask this because, of course, tribalism and coalitional thinking is very much a central feature of our architecture. And so even evolutionary scientists who otherwise are aware of these mechanisms will themselves succumb to tribalism when it comes to sort of their framework, their evolutionary framework. So I am a Santa Barbara domain-specific guy. I am a gene culture. Whereas I've argued, I'm not sure if successfully or not, but I've argued that really there's a place for all of these approaches. I really don't see why there needs to be these delineations, and either the domain-specific folks are right or the Joe Henrich types are right. Depending on the phenomenon, this will determine which approach I should abide to. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, the approach that I've been pushing is very much down the lines that you mentioned. Yeah, so I try to really avoid the tribalism. So Eric Smith wrote this paper in around 2000 or so, in which he defined three kinds of evolutionary approaches. So evolutionary psychology, where you might put the Santa Barbara camp; dual inheritance, where he would want to put me; and human behavioral ecology. But I really think, even about the time he was writing the paper, the divides between those divisions were artificial, and there were already people who were, doing work on both sides, interested in both using, say, optimization models the way behavioral ecologists do, but then beginning to think about the mechanisms or how cultural evolution, learning from others, might get you to that behavioral optimum. So I think it's really important to constantly remember that we are tribalists and not allow those walls to go up. I mean, just to give you a sense of how those walls come up, when someone like Celia Hayes, who's one of the defenders of a kind of general purpose social learning view, an Oxford psychologist, when she reads my book, she sees Santa Barbara. So she thinks I'm a modularist, and she immediately puts me into that camp. So you can read her review of my book. When my colleague Max Krasnow reads my book, he says this is just general purpose learning. This is Celia Hayes stuff. So I guess that means I'm pitching down the middle. I don't know. But,
Right. What about, so here's another sort of contentious debate within the evolutionary sciences. The group selectionism is a valuable part of our understanding of how selection works versus absolutely not. There is nothing that could be explained, that there's no phenomenon that can be explained at the group selection level that can't be reduced to a lower level. And then, of course, now there's sort of the multi-level selection theory. Where do you stand on this debate?
Yeah, well, so that's an interesting one, and I think it's exemplary of what we've been talking about. So I have a complex and nuanced view on this, which is that I'm in print making the case against genetic group selection of the kind championed by David Sloan Wilson, or at least in some papers, Sam Bowles. And the case, this core of the case I make against that is in human intergroup conflict. There's a lot of gene flow. In fact, when one group conquers another one, they often, take as secondary wives or sex partners members of the conquered group. So that creates a big inflow of genes, and that's just going to swamp any genetic variation. And whenever we look at the genes from small-scale societies, we find that genetic differences are tiny. So in our work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as a collaboration with some economists, we have genetic data, and there's just these tiny genetic differences between different tribes. but the cultural differences between these tribes are big. So while I'm on in print arguing against genetic group selection, I've spent a lot of my time making the case for intergroup competition shaping cultural evolution. Cultural groups can have institutions and rituals and a bunch of practices which are really a group level thing. Anything that has a division of labor where there are different roles, it doesn't exist within the mind of any one individual in the group. It only exists as a group level phenomenon, like a ritual. Rituals might, for example, increase social bonding and increase cooperation among participants. So this becomes something that can spread through intergroup competition. And when you apply the same mathematics to cultural variation, you find that the conditions are much more favorable. So there are big cultural differences between groups that are stable, even by groups that are right next to each other. There are matrilineal groups next to patrilineal groups. Different kinds of institutions, so there's groups with segmentary lineages, which is one kind of human way of organizing yourselves, next to groups without that. And we have lots of data showing systematic movement and conquest of groups with some cultural practices at the expense of others. And so one of the things I document in my book, besides some of the stuff we've discussed, like gene culture coevolution, is the cases of hunter-gatherers where one hunter-gatherer group expanded and wiped out another hunter-gatherer group or assimilated them. And so certain cultural practices spread at the expense of others.
Very cool. What's your view? I mean, I might know it, but I want you to say it for the audience on the religion as an adaptation versus an exaptation debate. And for those of you who don't know, well, why don't you? I mean, I've described it before, but why don't you explain what those two camps are, and then tell us what your views are?
Sure. Well, so there's a way of approaching religion that has its roots in the work of Dan Sperber and most famously by Pascal Boyer. It's been...
Who was on my show, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Pascal's great. Yeah. And picked up by people like Justin Barrett. And here the idea is that, humans have some evolved features of mind that help us process the world. They govern basic things like how we think about biology or how we think about physics or how we represent other minds. And these various specialized pieces of mental machinery make us susceptible to certain kinds of beliefs. And a lot of these are, one line of this work is that these are counterintuitive beliefs that violate or sort of tickle our mental modules in just the right way that make them more likely to be remembered and retransmitted. And the case that I have made recently with R. Noren Zion and colleagues in behavioral and brain sciences builds on that idea. So it takes as a given that we have these specializations. We particularly think that specialization like theory of mind is important. Our theory of mind capacities give rise to something we've documented cross-culturally, which is dualism. So our ability to think of minds and bodies as separate, even though as best we know, they can't actually be separated. But once you can separate them, then you can do different things. You can have heavenly places, you can have spirits, you can have ghosts, and you can give rise to all those phenomena. So we begin with that foundation. So it's not that we at all disagree with that. We just think there's more to the story. And then the more to the story is that if some of these agents punished people who violated group norms, especially group norms that gave groups success in intergroup competition, so say not running away in warfare, then those beliefs, those supernatural agents, the rituals that help underpin those supernatural beliefs would tend to spread at the expense of groups that just believed in malevolent ghosts or just believed in witches that didn't do anything that galvanized social solidarity. The same is true of just rituals. So I mentioned earlier that, dancing in sync or going through a painful, terrifying initiation rite may actually build bonds amongst males. So if you have a group that does that, then that particular ritual has a chance to spread. And we know in Australia historically, it actually spread as one group copied another group. And that spread across the landscape. So that's cultural group selection in action. And it's working because of the ritual's ability to build enduring bonds among males, which give that group an advantage in competition with other groups.
Now, what I'm going to ask you next might be delicate because it might be a slight, gentle, polite critique of one of your colleagues, because you mentioned the word male bonding. And so it reminded me of the work of Scott Atran, wherein in studying the motives of ISIS fighters, he comes up with all sorts of explanations. But there is one big, huge elephant that is never mentioned. So there's male bonding, there's sensation seeking, there's all sorts of very earthly reasons why people join ISIS. But it certainly couldn't have anything to do with the religion itself. Do you have any views on that? I know I'm putting you in a difficult spot because I'm asking you to critique a colleague, but what are your views on that? Do you think he was being too politically correct by ignoring that central feature, or do you truly believe that there is no fundamental religious driver in people joining ISIS?
Well, you mean can supernatural beliefs play a role?
Yeah, because I mean, basically, for example, if you look at the data of the 80 plus countries from which people have come to join ISIS, it turns out that culture doesn't explain that because they come from every conceivable variation of cultural expression. What they share in common is that they are either born into an Islamic family or they converted to Islam. So if I were to conduct a discriminant analysis, as happens in, say, marketing, to try to identify what are the variables that best predict my membership in being an ISIS or not, then I couldn't make up data that is any clearer. It's 100% discriminating, right? In other words, in the real world of, say, marketing, where you're trying to predict why some people are loyal to your brand or not, you don't get remotely as clear as data as this. But yet Scott Atran was able to come up with all sorts of alternate reasons why people join ISIS, none of which were rooted in Islam. I thought that was a bit strange.
So on this question, I'll give you two answers. You might not like the first, but you might like the second, which is I don't know enough about Islam and ISIS to have any sort of formed opinion. So now what I'm going to say isn't specific to the ISIS case. It's a more general statement. More generally, I think it's quite clear that supernatural beliefs and religious commitments cause people to join violent groups and to attack people who have somewhat different views on supernatural beliefs and rituals. So as a general statement, I think it's quite defensible. I don't know enough to make a case for you or against Scott in this specific case.
Got you. All right. Very diplomatic. Let's return to, for a second, some of the canards against evolutionary. I mean, we could call it evolutionary behavioral sciences or evolutionary psychology in particular. In one of my books, I list a bunch of the sort of attacks against evolutionary theory. So, for example, you look at someone like PZ, I guess you guys would say PZ maybe, but in Canada we say PZ. PZ Myers. Are you familiar? Do you know who that guy is?
Vaguely.
So he's a developmental biologist who became sort of very famous for having a very popular scientific blog, and on that blog he wouldn't be worthy of our attention other than the fact that he has a very big platform from which he rails against the stupidity of evolutionary behavioral sciences and evolutionary psychology and so on. And the reason why I use him is because he is a perfect manifestation of a phenomenon which I love the coining of the term, the human reticence effect. This is not my term. This is the idea that we could take an evolutionary principle and apply it in explaining the behavior of every single species on Earth except one, in humans, right? So I could take a phenomenon to explain the mating behavior of the salamander. Now, if I take the exact same epistemological, conceptual, theoretical framework to explain the behavior of humans, now it becomes just so storytelling. It becomes bullshit, hand-waving, theorizing, and so on. Do you think that we will ever be able to break through this impenetrable tsunami of stupidity? Or is this something that is fundamental to this culture wars, and that there will always be people who will be ruffled by the implications of evolutionary theory, whatever these might be?
I think we're going to win in the long run. Okay. I just don't know how long the long run is. If you look at, I feel like we can already document progress since the 1970s, say. Increasingly in psychology, I think it's more and more okay to use an evolutionary theory. I mean, you can still get zapped for bringing it up, say, in developmental psychology or something. But that just requires a lot of re-education. So pushing people to do more training in evolution. And there's some movements afoot to do that. In economics, people are getting more and more interested in evolutionary approaches. We're not at a tipping point yet there. I feel like there's baby steps, and we're making progress in baby steps.
Yeah, so I mean, I often use J.B.S. Haldane's famous quote where he explains the 4 stages that scientists go through before they accept an idea, and I'm going to paraphrase it here. I don't remember the exact words. So stage 1, this is nonsense. This is absurd. This is bullshit. Stage 2, well, this may be true but perverse. Stage 3, well, this is true but largely unimportant. And stage 4, oh, I always said so. I always believed it to be true, right? And I find this particular quote uniquely poignant to me, and perhaps you might agree in your own career, because I've now had a long enough career that I've gone through those 4 stages, oftentimes with the same individual, having kept their emails in my account, where the guy said, well, your stuff is utter bullshit, Gad. And then 12 years later, oh, we would be honored in having you come speak at our school. But I thought I was an utter bullshitter. Well, the reality is he went through the 4 stages in 12 or 13 years. So I think I'm sympathetic to your idea that it really is just a function of science being an autocorrective process. And if we're patient enough, most people will eventually say, well, yeah, no kidding, evolutionary theory matters to understanding human behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, and I like the way you set it up, because there at least people will change in the course of their lifetime. Because the other way this works is people eventually pass out of the field and retire, and their students are less skeptical than their advisors.
Right. Yeah. You don't want the paradigmatic shift to only come because the old guard dies out.
Right.
You want
natural selection.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Okay, let's talk about 1 or 2 of your papers. Earlier you mentioned.
Wait, I wanted to toss out a quick.
Sure.
So I've had the exact experience that you talked about, and I'll just mention how I had it. So in the mid '90s, I started using a tool from behavioral economics called the Ultimatum Game.
Love it.
And I did it in these small-scale societies. I started off doing it in Peru with a group called the Mancheganga. And I got very different results than they were getting in the standard undergraduate experiments that had been done in the U.S. and a few other industrialized societies. And when I first went, I'm an anthropology graduate student. I've been reading a lot of economics papers, but I don't know the field at all. So I get invited to present to economists, which if you've ever done that, it's like a ritual or something. So you have to pass through the rite.
Yes.
And I had trouble getting to the part where I was going to show this interesting variation between populations. Because when I would present the Ultimatum Game to mainstream economists, they couldn't get past the basic result with the undergrads, that they would behave in a non-selfish way. And now, economists assume people are altruistic and assume people are non-selfish, and they're like, "Oh, we never thought people would." People yelled at me when I was a graduate student. You can't tell me that.
Well, I might be able to actually go back earlier in the genesis of the Ultimatum Game than you, in that you probably heard that Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize a few days ago. Well, Dick Thaler was my professor at Cornell.
Okay.
And so I was right there. I mean, I heard about the Ultimatum Game and all that stuff straight from the horse's mouth.
Right.
And actually, I've used the Ultimatum Game in a different way. In your case, I mean, you take it to a cross-cultural setting. In my case, what I did, this was with one of my former doctoral students, we looked at both the Ultimatum Game and the Dictator Game. Specifically looked at the sex makeup of the dyad and argued, so male, female, male, male, female, male, female, female, and argued that the size of the offer in each of those 4 dyads would vary. So yes, on average, it's around 50%, but it will vary higher or lower as a function of the unique dynamics of each of those dyads. So in the male-female cell, you'd have the largest offers precisely because men wish to show that they're generous and blah, blah, blah. Whereas in the male cell, that's where you get the greatest amount of intrasexual competition on a cue that really matters to men, which is resources. And that's exactly what we found. So in our case, we used sexual dynamics from evolutionary theory to study these games. But by the way, since some of the people might not know what those games are, I could either explain them or you can, just so that people don't say, what the hell are these guys talking about? Do you want to explain the 2 games very quickly?
Okay. So these are tools from behavioral economics. They're interesting because they put real money on the line. So these are actual economic decisions. The standard setup is it's anonymous, so you don't get to see the other people you're playing with. The games we're talking about are one shot. So you only have one interaction. You'll never see the person again. These allow straightforward predictions from game theory. If you assume people want more money, they prefer more money to less. You can get predictions. So the ultimatum game runs like this. So two players are allotted a sum of money, say $100. The first player, who's called the proposer, can offer any portion of that $100 to the second player, who's called the responder. The responder can then either accept or reject the offer. If they accept it, they get the amount the proposer offers, and the proposer keeps the remainder. If they reject, both players get zero. So a simple example would be if the proposer offered $10 out of the 100 to the responder. If the responder accepts it, they get 10, and the proposer keeps 90. If the responder rejects, both players get zero. So to figure out what the selfish actor would do, you put yourself into the shoes of the responder, and you see, well, if he gives me a very low number, what will I do? Well, I have a choice between no money if I reject and some money if I accept. So then I'm going to accept. What this tells you is that responders should accept any positive offer, and then the proposer should anticipate that, assuming they believe responders are self-interested, and make a very low offer, just enough to get the proposer to respond. So that's the prediction. When you do this amongst university students, or even more strongly among adults, older than students, you get a modal offer of 50%. Mean offer among non-student adults is about 48%. With students, it drops to about 45%, 44%. But this varies dramatically across human societies. So we've done this in 23 different small-scale societies. And you get the lowest mean is about 25%, and it scales all the way up to a mean of about 58%.
What's the singular trait within those 25 societies that you've studied that best describes the variance, in the behavior?
Well, there's two variables that we like, that we think explain the best. One is the percentage of market integration. Okay. So having experience with markets where you have to make lots of transactions with people who you don't necessarily have a personal relationship, you don't have any kind of ongoing thing. People who live in those kinds of societies tend to be generous in the ultimatum game. So more market-integrated societies, higher offers, further from self-interest. And also societies with big moralizing gods. So the religion seems to play a role. And we've spent a lot of time kind of exploring the religion angle on this.
More God, fairer I am in my offer.
That's right.
Right, okay. When you were describing the ultimatum game, by the way, the dictator game, for those of you who don't know, is exactly the same game, except that player B doesn't have a veto power. So whatever the player A says, I'm going to keep $8, I'm going to give you $2. That's what the final split is. But you use the word anonymous, which of course in the publication that I talked about, that anonymity is removed. In other words, I do know whether I'm playing against, I see I'm playing against a woman, or I know that it's a woman or a man. I can even see if they're good looking or not, and so on. And so do you think that the anonymity part is problematic in that it's not an ecologically valid? It doesn't sort of meet the mundane realism criterion, in which case when you ran it cross-culturally, was it anonymous, or were you doing it with the face-to-face ecological validity approach?
Well, we say that you're interacting with someone else from your community.
Okay.
And so they know it's another person that they know. They just don't know who it is.
Got it.
And that's like lots of public goods in the real world, right? People can throw away trash. They can give blood. So we have lots of times where we interact with people who we don't know and won't see again.
So since we're talking about these cross-cultural issues, what I was going to talk about next was, you have many, many wonderful papers, but probably the one that I love best, and I certainly use with all my doctoral students. Can you guess which one's going to be?
No.
The weird paper.
Okay.
And people might be puzzled now. What do I mean by weird? So why don't you explain to us that I wasn't denigrating your work. It's not weird in the colloquial sense. It's an acronym. So tell us what weird refers to, and then tell us about that behavioral and brain science paper.
So WEIRD is an acronym. It stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And we developed this acronym with my colleagues Art Norenzayan and Steve Heinen, who are psychologists at the University of British Columbia, as just a handy way of labeling the populations most commonly studied by psychologists. So these are mostly undergraduates. About 70% of psychology is done with American undergraduates. Over 90% of even developmental or social psychology is done with Westerners of one type or another. And what this paper argues, based on a lot of evidence, is that Westerners are psychologically unusual when placed in global perspective. So whenever possible, we try to plot graphs showing the variation across human societies. Now, one thing I think it's important, and I've been trying to emphasize this more and more, is you don't want to, the weird acronym, I think it invites people to set up a dichotomy in their mind between Westerners, weird people, and non-weird. But one of the things we tried to show in our paper is that there's a lot of variation. It just so happens that the Westerners seem to cluster at one end of distributions that are more or less continuous, not dichotomous.
Well, and I mean, there are several things that I love about that paper. One of which, if I remember correctly, you demonstrated that certain phenomena that a priori you could have bet the house on that they were human universals, like perceptual illusions, actually turn out to not be human universal. I think the example that you have provided, I don't know if it's a speculative one or one that has been established, is that depending on how much you've been exposed in your environment to sort of angles, to angular architecture or other structures, that will determine the likelihood of you succumbing. Was it Ponzo's illusion, or which illusion?
It's called the Muller-Lyer illusion.
Muller, right, okay.
So it's the one with the arrows, either in arrows or out arrows.
Exactly.
And I mean, if you look at the distribution across about 16 societies, the Western population was Northwestern undergraduates, and they have the strongest version of this Muller-Lyer illusion. And it scales all the way down to hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari, where there aren't carpenter corners, and actually the houses are kind of dome-shaped, and not so many trees. And they don't see the illusion. So they just call it Muller-Lyer drawing.
Would that have been the paper, for those of you who don't know, behavioral and brain sciences papers, the way it's structured is there's sort of a target article that's just extraordinarily dense and rich, and then a bunch of people then sort of rebut, offer commentary. So by definition, any paper that's published in behavioral and brain science is going to be dense. But certainly your paper was just, it takes 2 weeks to get through that paper if you're very, and I mean that as a very high compliment. So of all the stuff that you covered there, would that have been one of the things that surprised you the most? Because that's one of the things that I remember from this paper. Because as I said, I could have absolutely bet the house that would have been, that perceptual bias would have been a morphological feature of the human body that would be invariant across all cultures, and yet you showed that that's not the case. So was that how you reacted to it?
So I knew about that for years, actually, and I published it in a prior paper on impenetrability, actually chiming in on a philosophical debate. But because that data actually comes from the 1960s. I actually ran across it. So this is one of the problems with the internet these days, is I ran across it when I was kind of squirreling around in the Emory library, and I was looking for a different book, and I'm like, Culture and Visual Illusions, 1966, and I grabbed that book.
Wow.
So I just happened across it. And that book is full of other illusions too. I think there's 4 or 5 other illusions that show lots of interesting cultural variation. So, and that's a cool project because it was an interdisciplinary project between psychologists and anthropologists, which sort of, we tried to revive that later, but there was a big dip where there wasn't much collaboration.
Well, what you use the word right now, interdisciplinary, which is a perfect segue to my next question. So I argue in several of my writings that the epistemology of evolutionary theory engenders certain benefits that could otherwise not be garnered by anything else. So methodological pluralism, interdisciplinarity, consilience, the lesser likelihood of succumbing to the weird bias. All of these things I argue, are fundamental inoculations against succumbing to, for example, having methodological myopia is less likely to happen when you're an evolutionary scientist by the very nature of how you approach problems. You're less likely to be committed to a paradigm. You're by the epistemology of the field. So in your case, I noticed, I just went to your Google Scholar, page. You've published all over the place. Now, to me, that's a wonderful thing. That's something for everybody to aspire to have. Yet the traditional, advice that we give our graduate students is publish in one of the 2 or 3 journals that are best in your field, do plus epsilon bullshit for the next 25 years, and that's how you become known in an extraordinarily narrow field. Now, in my case, I've had a very different career in that I truly am a polymath, not only in my scientific career, but I create this channel. I'm just interested in ideas. I'm interested in traversing endless intellectual landscapes. So what do you tell your students? Do you tell them, hey, follow my lead and be a committed interdisciplinarian, or do you fall to the standard advice that typically people give?
Well, I can't give the standard advice, and I'm liberated since moving to Harvard because I'm in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. So there are only choices to be interdisciplinary. So there's much less disciplinary. I feel much less disciplinary pressure for my students in human evolutionary biology, because the idea is we're going to take evolutionary theory, we're going to test it, and how we test it is completely, we use whatever methods are best for attacking the problem. And that's what I've always done. However, when I was a professor of psychology and economics at UBC, I had grad students in psychology, and they worked in my lab, and I had to train them. I wanted to get jobs. So there I was always a little bit more leery of just say, let's just follow our hearts and see where they lead. So I always worked, with one or two exceptions, with students who had another advisor, a real psychologist as opposed to me. And so I would let my colleague take care of you must get a JPSP paper, or you must get a developmental science paper. And I took care of the other side.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel that exact same tension with my students, because like you, I recognize that there are certain market realities. Now, I could choose to ignore them and, walk to my own drummer, or whatever the expression is. But then if I'm training my students for, hopefully giving them maximal success, I would be wrong in not at least telling them what the reality is. And so I try to exactly strike the balance that you did, which is tell them to always sort of follow their passion and go wherever they need to go, whilst recognizing that they don't operate in a vacuum, and getting, so in marketing, it'll be a journal of consumer research, or a journal of consumer psychology, or a journal of marketing research. So you sort of have to tick that, and then if you publish in science, fine. But it's interesting that even publishing in a journal like Science could be construed as a negative thing in the marketing discipline, right? I mean, why are you
really okay? That's interesting. I wouldn't guess that. So I deal with this with students in economics, because I have a lot of economists in my lab. And in economics, you really want to be in one of the top 5 economics journals. And, Science and Nature are a step down, for sure.
Exactly right. And now I think, and this next theory that I'm going to yet again state publicly, regrettably doesn't make me popular with some of my marketing colleagues. I think, but who cares? The truth is more important than popularity. I think that it really comes from a deep insecurity as to where you stand in the pantheon of sciences, right? Do you really belong as an equal member in the table of science? And one of the ways that you do that when you are insecure about your position, so economics, yes, because we want it to be like those bastard physicists with all those fancy mathematical equations. By the way, I come from mathematics, so it's not as though I'm intimidated by math. But you have physics envy when you are a economist. When you are, say, a consumer psychologist in marketing, then you want to demonstrate that you are a serious scientist. Well, one of the ways that you do that is by having extraordinary methodological rigor, right? So it's a 2x4x3, it's ANCOVA, ANOVA, structural equation, bullshit this, bullshit that. But the final research question that I study is profoundly uninteresting and unimportant. But if I walk like a scientist, if I quack like a scientist, then surely I must be a real scientist. And so I think that as a function of how, and this would be an empirical question that we could test, the likelihood of people being open to interdisciplinarity, I predict, is correlated to the perceived security of the field. The more insecure you are, the more tribal you are regarding the types of journals you can publish in. What do you think of this hypothesis?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true. I mean, I know a lot of social psychologists kind of worry that they're even taken seriously as scientists. Right. And I certainly know economists are a bit suspicious of work in psychology. So that, that's kind of justified in terms of how they're viewed in other disciplines. Another thing I wonder is whether that also works at the individual level. So one of the things I've noticed is that people are aspiring to be a psychologist. They want to have a psychologist's identity or be an economist. Those are the two disciplines that I know. Whereas I think you're better off if you're trying to answer questions and you're not trying to be a member of the discipline. Because as you try to be a member of the discipline, you move to the center of the discipline, which means you're not on the leading edge.
That's beautiful. That's exactly right. I consider myself an ideas guy, right? Instead of being a tourist that goes to Jamaica today and Antigua tomorrow, I just traverse intellectual landscapes. And if Henrich comes to me today and says, "Hey, Dad, give it some of your interest. How about we work on this project?" I couldn't give a damn. It wouldn't even enter my mind where are we going to publish it. Now, maybe it's to a fault. I think that I haven't been nearly enough of a careerist, and that has actually harmed my career in some sense, right? But I don't care. If you tickle my intellectual bone, then that's all it's going to take for me to go with you. And I wish we could sort of instill that more in science and return to the sort of awe and wonder of just doing science for the purity of doing it.
Yeah. So do you have ideas about how we do that? I mean, my big idea is creating departments like Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, because I feel like that opens up the world. I mean, I guess we have societies now like cultural evolution, or HBES. So these kind of interdisciplinary communities.
Well, I've done, by the way, speaking of HBES, in trying to demonstrate, the extent to which evolutionary theory engenders interdisciplinarity versus, say, consumer behavior, which pretends to be interdisciplinary but isn't. I looked at the membership, the departmental affiliation of people who are in the Association for Consumer Research, which ACR, which is sort of the top consumer research scientific organization, versus HBES, and almost everyone who was in ACR came from the business school. Some were trained in psychology, a few were trained in economics, but ultimately they were housed in the business schools. Whereas I listed something like 30, 40, I can't remember the exact number of fields that were covered. You could have a person who is a literature, applying Darwinian theory in literature. You could have an ornithologist. You could have a law person. And so that was a very vivid way to demonstrate, again, the interdisciplinarity that is engendered by evolutionary theory.
Right. Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, good. All right, let's move on now, getting out of the science, but still staying within the campus environment. What are your thoughts about the craziness? I hope that's not a leading question by saying craziness, but by the campus atmosphere that is taking place, the political correctness, the microaggressions, the safe spaces, the cultural appropriation, all that stuff. Do you see it a lot at Harvard? And independently of whether you see it or not, what are your views on this reality?
Well, I certainly have from time to time worried about those things. And of course, you see reports of all these things at campuses like Harvard and Yale and places like that. For me, it runs so counter to my approach to teaching and mentoring and knowledge and things that I've been ignoring it.
Right.
I teach classes. One of my goals in teaching classes is to make people feel uncomfortable. So we talk about female genital cutting, or we talk about circumcision rituals, or we talk about variation in sex roles across societies, or warfare and cannibalism. And, I want the students to kind of see the world as it is and has been. And I guess I've gotten away with it.
Oh, yeah. So I was going to ask you, so you haven't had someone get upset at you because you haven't given the requisite trigger warning before you discuss female genital mutilation? Or so it's all been smooth sailing so far?
Well, it's been mostly smooth sailing. I got a really unhappy teaching review at UBC one time when I showed a film on female genital cutting that I guess made someone feel uncomfortable. So I do say, so I just sort of naturally incorporated this before trigger warnings became a term, but just say, look, I think it's important. I basically give a speech like the one I just gave to you. And, but if you're uncomfortable, close your eyes or leave, that's totally fine. And then I press on. So I do give a kind of, buckle up.
Right. Nice. Well, because I guess you probably are familiar with the fact that Larry Summers used to be the president at Harvard. And so that's why, I was kind of interested in hearing about what the Harvard ecosystem was like. As a matter of fact, I actually mentioned Harvard in another context recently. I gave testimony in front of the Canadian Senate back in May regarding something called Bill C-16, which is colloquially become known as the gender pronoun. It's not just about gender pronouns, it's about gender identity and gender expression. And in my testimony in front of the Senate, I basically took an anecdote or reality from Harvard, the Office of LGBTQ, whatever, I don't remember the exact letters, but they came out with a pamphlet that said that gender identity and gender expression is not only something that is real, but that it could fluctuate daily. So Monday I could be male, Tuesday I could be female, Wednesday I could be non-gendered. But secondly, and this is truly relevant to someone like you who teaches evolutionary behavioral sciences, as someone like me, if you promulgate, this is them speaking, if you promulgate, quote, fixed binaries and biological essentialism, close quote, then you are engaging in transphobic systemic violence, right? That's not allegorical, it's not metaphorical. If you walk into class and say, hello class, my name is Professor Henrich, and I will be discussing evolved sex differences. There's this thing called male, there's this thing called female, there's this thing called secondary sexual characteristics, this is how they evolved. That could be construed as transphobic systemic violence. And I argued that, of course, the transgendered and intersexed individuals exist and they should be afforded every dignity and every protection that the law allows, but certainly we can't abide by such nonsense. So what do you think of that?
Well, I mean, we've already, so last fall, I co-taught a course called Human Nature with Richard Wrangham, who's one of the world's experts on chimpanzee behavior, and Alex Rosati. So she studies comparing monkeys and apes to children, looking at kind of cognitive decision-making, risk-taking, temporal discounting. Very interesting work. And I think Richard and Alex did all the heavy lifting on this, but there was no shying around gender differences.
Right.
Wrangham starts off with male chimps and female chimps and talks about their gender differences, and then he rolls right into understanding, human males, as how they think about hierarchy and how that leads to different behavior in males and females in terms of how they treat hierarchy and sexual behavior. I mean, mostly standard story. Although Richard has a particular interest in that stuff. And that's just it. We didn't get any flack.
No problem. Okay, good. So it's not as much of an insane asylum as otherwise I might think it might be.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could have had a student that would have raised a stink, but I can tell you, Richard wasn't going to back down.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear it. Did you ever interact at all with not that I'm fanboying him, or maybe I am, with E.O. Wilson?
No, I haven't had a chance yet. But he's actually in my building, so hopefully I'll see him at some point.
Oh, right. There's a great story, and I'm not sure where I heard it. This goes back to when Bob Trivers. For those of you who don't know who are watching this, is a very famous living biologist. Some have argued that he's, maybe the greatest biologist since Darwin. When he was a graduate student at Harvard, E.O. Wilson apparently recounts a story that when Bob Trivers would come to his office and they would have a chat, after the chat, he would be so intellectually exhausted that he'd have to take the rest of the day off. This is E.O. Wilson speaking, right? He's not exactly a dunce, but that was the power. Anyways, yeah. I guess, have you ever interacted with Bob?
And I mean, so our course on human nature, we attract a lot of majors. So our department has a relatively large number of majors. And so I think, students, there's a big swath of students who, just want to figure out how the world is.
Oh,
and they're not as worried about being politically correct as the news sometimes makes it seem.
Oh, that's heartwarming to hear. Okay, two last questions. First one, how can we get more academics, irrespective of what they study, to get out of their proverbial labs, so to speak, and actually build a bridge with the public? Very much how you and I are doing right now. Probably, I don't know how many views we'll get, but I can assure you that it'll be probably an impressive number eventually. And so, of course, one of our mandates is to create knowledge and do serious science and publish in top peer-reviewed journals. But I think what is always forgotten is that we also have the mandate, which very few professors meet, of being publicly engaged. Some of us do it and do it well and do it often. Others don't. Do you have a recipe for how we can try to create greater incentives for people to come into the public sphere?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I sort of generally agree with your point that it would be good if more scientists engaged with the public. And I mean, there are some existing incentive structures. So I know in Canada, for example, the granting agencies require you to kind of provide a plan on how you're going to reach out. I'm never clear how much that actually plays into the giving of the grants, though. I mean, we could include valuation sort of on outreach as part of your service to the university. And I guess anything we can do to make it easier, although with technology these days, it seems to be pretty easy. Yeah, that's not one I've thought too much about. I mean, in my own career, I haven't reached out too much, except I really enjoy writing The Secret of Our Success. So I'm writing another kind of broad audience type book now. But that's not out of a sense of duty. That's just out of a sense of fun.
Well, it's also, I'm sorry, for me, it's also the idea that there's a unique excitement that comes from it. I don't know if this is a good term, but sort of the velocity of the spread of knowledge, right? So when you and I send papers to be peer reviewed, there's an impatience, right? I mean, I'm tired of going through 73 different rounds of revisions and controlling for this and control. I mean, not that I'm suggesting that we should ever give up on methodological rigor, but it's a very slow moving train. And then eventually, when your paper gets published, you're lucky if 5 years later, 100 people have cited it. Well, it's a very successful paper. But you and I could have a conversation here, and I know for a fact that in a few days, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people have actually consumed our memes, our ideas, our exchange. And there's a unique excitement. And it doesn't come from narcissism. It's not because I want to see myself on the YouTube channel, but it just comes from the excitement of the speed at which ideas can be shared. And I think that more people should be doing this, right?
Yeah. So one experience I had on this kind of public engagement is I was asked by the Attorney General in British Columbia to be an expert witness in a trial they held in British Columbia on the question of whether it's constitutional to outlaw polygamous marriage. And so that was a case where, I argued in front of the Chief Justice that, I laid out a whole evolutionary case. I did a 3-hour PowerPoint, really founded on kind of differences in mating strategies between men and women and why so many societies end up being polygynous, and then how monogamous marriage alters our hormones and psychology in ways that are, beneficial to society if you care about lower crime and less risk-taking and things like that. And I mean, that evolutionary theory really became the kind of intellectual foundation for the judge's eventual decision to uphold the statute. So, I mean, that's kind of a positive case where evolution does seem to be playing a role in important areas.
Oh, very cool. Okay, last question. I guess you hinted at the fact that you're working on a next book. Are there any projects that are not yet, that people don't know about that you'd like to use this platform to promote?
Well, I'll just mention the plan on my new book. So we talked about the Weird People paper. And, I enjoyed writing that paper, and, we wanted to do this very specific thing, but I always found the paper unsatisfying because we documented this variation and we hadn't explained anything. So one of my frustrations with cultural psychology is that it's a little bit like butterfly collecting. So they go around, they show, I got a difference here, I got a difference here. It's usually between Asians and Americans. But what we should be trying to do is develop theories that we lay out ahead of time and try to explain variation between populations. And that could be across countries, but you can explain variation within China the way Thomas Talhelm did in a science piece recently. So the book is really an effort to explain a lot of the cultural variation we see and why Westerners are so frequently at the tail end of the distribution on these psychological measures. And it took me into a lot of European history. So the centerpiece in the European history is about how institutions, and I'm thinking here of family institutions, and eventually markets and stuff, changed in ways that then shifted people's psychology, adapted ontogenetically to this different environment. And so that's the book I'm working on.
That's going to be a trade book meant for the masses? Or
yes.
Okay, very nice. Will you be using an evolutionary lens to explain these cross-cultural differences?
Yeah, so the chapter 2 of the new book, which is in draft form, is a summary of the secret of our success. And then the secret of our success framework is the framework that I use to approach these questions. So at the core of all this lies evolution. And, I just talked about monogamous marriage, so that's part of the story. And monogamous marriage, for good evolutionary reasons, affects male testosterone. It's evolution all the way through. But of course, we got to deal with institutions and social norms and these other things that play a real role in shaping our behavior in the world.
When can we expect it in print?
Well, I better have a draft done by next summer. So it just depends on how long the press takes after that.
Well, thank you then for taking time to speak to me, because I know what it is to have a gun to your head as the book publishers are seeking the book. Stay on the line. It's been a true pleasure chatting with you, Joe. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Great to be with you.
You too. Cheers.